I'm Professor Rob Layfield, an academic at the University of Nottingham, and I'm the chair of the research subcommittee here at the Paget's Association, research into ancient Paget's disease. We've known for some time that the northwest of England is actually a hotspot for Paget's disease. And in fact, recent published research funded in part by the Paget's Association from Dr. Terry O'Neill in Salford has confirmed that the northwest of England still has one of the highest rates of Paget's disease in the world. So in this epidemiological study, what Dr. O'Neill did was looked at the incidence of Paget's disease across the United Kingdom, found that the northwest was still, as I mentioned, a hotspot for Paget's, but also unusually noticed that Paget's disease is changing and the incidence of Paget's is reducing over the past 10 to 20 years. So it's not only today, though, that Paget's disease is still common in the northwest of England. It turns out that actually, as far back as medieval times, there were clusters of Paget's disease at different places within the northwest. And a few years ago, we became interested in these ancient medieval forms of Paget's disease through a collaboration with a museum in Runcorn, so just outside or close to Liverpool in the northwest of England, called Norton Priory. And Norton Priory is a museum on the site of the largest monastic excavation in Europe. Now, what happened was, and very briefly, we were contacted by the curators and the keepers at Norton Priory Museum because they had started to notice that in their collection of about 130 different human skeletons that were excavated from the Norton Priory site, there were bone changes that were similar to those that we see in Paget's disease today, but also very different. And the more that they looked at these skeletons, it emerged that this ancient bone disease was really unusual. So, as I mentioned, it looked like Paget's, but they were unsure whether it really was Paget's disease. And some of the major differences were, for example, in prevalence. We think today that something like 1% of the over 55s may be affected by Paget's disease, whereas in the adult collection of the 130 skeletons at Norton Priory, they detected, or there was evidence of Paget's disease in maybe 15 or 20% of the skeletons. Today, if one's affected by Paget's, it's usually just one or a very small number of bones, whereas in some of the skeletons at Norton Priory, as much as 3/4 of the bones could have been affected with Paget's. And on top of that, then at Norton Priory, the onset was typically in very young adulthood, in skeletons from individuals in the early 20s. But despite these really unusual extended features and early onset, many of the complications that we see in Paget's disease today were not present. So deformities and these so-called pseudo fractures as well. So actually, there was an outstanding question: was this Paget's-like condition seen in the medieval collection, was this really Paget's disease? And we began our research collaboration with Norton Priory, and we were able, through analysing molecules and actually proteins that were preserved for hundreds of years in samples of bone at Norton Priory, we were able to confirm through molecular analysis that this actually was a mystery condition that was Paget's disease, or at least had all the signatures and the molecular markers of Paget's disease, but clearly was what we call phenotypically very different. And just on this slide at the bottom right-hand side, you see one of our very first ancient protein sequences that we were able to determine in order to retro-diagnose this condition. So that's a protein called sequestosome 1 that we know is closely linked to contemporary Paget's disease, and we were able to detect high levels of this sequestosome 1 protein in the skeletons from Norton Priory. So this supported our diagnosis. So this kind of made us realize that ancient Paget's disease was a thing, and other populations and other researchers have now started to recognize medieval forms of Paget's disease in their excavations as well. Now, this is an interesting observation in its own right, that Paget's disease through time may have been very different to Paget's disease today. But we also have realized that this is an opportunity to try and understand the triggers for Paget's disease. So what drives Paget's disease back in medieval times, and are they relevant for what we're seeing today as well? And the Paget's Association then has just funded a research project from Professor Sylvia Gonzalez, Liverpool John Moores University, not only looking at genetic family links in the Norton Priory collection, but making environmental measurements, so looking for evidence of the environmental triggers that might account for that unusual form of Paget's at Norton Priory. So this is measuring things like heavy metals in the soils and other things in the environment at Norton Priory to see whether they were perhaps potentiating the unusual phenotypes that we're seeing. And so I can direct you again to our website, where Sylvia is one of the contributors to this presentation. Could medieval skeletons change the history of disease? They talk about investigating Paget's disease at Norton Priory. So this work is reporting very soon and has already found some really unusual measurements of environmental factors that could be considered as being the drivers, the triggers in medieval times, and certainly we need to think about their impact on bone biology in contemporary models as well, to see if they could be relevant to Paget's disease today. Our group has also extended our work into ancient proteins and ancient Paget's disease, and born or as a kind of follow on from the original work we did with the skeletons from Norton Priory to diagnose this ancient Paget's disease. We've realized that other proteins beyond that sequestosome 1, that biomarker protein for Paget's disease, can be preserved in skeletal remains, human skeletal remains. And actually, some of those other proteins can give us even broader insights into the life history of individuals living with ancient Paget's disease. And one of the things we've just reported on is this realization that ancient teeth, medieval human teeth, preserve antibody proteins. So antibodies are the proteins that our bodies naturally produce in response to bacterial infection and viral infection. They're what help keep us healthy. And we've realized that these antibody molecules are not only preserved for hundreds of years in medieval human teeth, but we can purify these antibodies, and these antibodies still have a degree of function associated with them. And having this function of antibodies then means that the antibodies have a molecular memory. By reading that molecular memory using clinical tests, we can work out what antibodies were present and therefore potentially what pathogens were present. And our idea, or one of our ideas, is that there may have been some sort of viral trigger for Paget's disease that was associated with this very unusual phenotype. And so one of the things that we want to do next is to extend this work and start to unpick ancient antibodies from cases of ancient Paget's disease and start to realize what immune responses these individuals had, and maybe were they some sort of indicator of the further environmental triggers that may have caused Paget's disease or the unusual Paget's disease back in medieval times. And once again, all of this then is relevant for Paget's disease today and Paget's in the future as well. Understanding the past helps inform the future.